The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon while I was refilling the bird feeder in my own backyard, and it lasted less than 90 seconds. It also happened to be the exact moment I found out my family had been planning my stepson's wedding for 6 weeks without telling me it had a date. "Mrs. Whitfield, this is Ashley from Cypress Hall. I'm just finalizing the floor plan for Saturday, and I have you still listed on the original deposit as a secondary contact. Can you confirm the final head count is 180 and that you'll still be arriving with the wedding party at 4? I set the bag of birdseed down very carefully on the porch railing. "Saturday," I said. "This Saturday." "Yes, ma'am. The Whitfield Bell wedding? Is there an issue with the timing?" There was, in fact, an enormous issue with the timing, though not the kind Ashley from Cypress Hall could have guessed from my voice, which came out level and pleasant. The same voice I used to use giving a status report over a headset at 31,000 feet, with a patient's blood pressure dropping in front of me. "No issue at all," I said. "Could you read me the names on the head table, just so I can confirm the seating matches what I have?" She read them. Tyler and Emily, of course, at the center, then Emily's parents, then Bob, my husband, and 2 names down, Patricia Larkin. Tyler's mother, his first mother, the one who left when he was 8 years old and reappeared, politely and periodically, at the exact moments that mattered most on paper. My name wasn't on the list at all. Not at the head table, not anywhere, Ashley read off before she thanked me and hung up, satisfied that Mrs. Whitfield had confirmed everything just fine. I stood in my backyard for a long moment with a half-empty bag of birdseed and 22 years of Air Force service behind me, and I did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. I laughed, once, short and without much humor in it, and then I went inside to make a phone call of my own. I should tell you who I actually am, because for the last 19 years, this family has only ever known the shorthand version. My name is Diane Whitfield. Before that, Diane Foster. And before that, Major Diane Foster, United States Air Force, Aeromedical Evacuation. 22 years of service, most of it spent on medevac flights, the ones that pick up the worst injured patients from forward locations and keep them alive for the hours it takes to get them somewhere with a real operating room. I've run IV drips through turbulence that would have sent a coffee cup across the cabin. I've made calls on a patient's airway at altitude, with a flight surgeon a curtain away and 30 seconds to decide, before the decision made itself. I retired a major, with a chest of ribbons I've worn exactly twice since, both times for funerals. I married Bob Whitfield when Tyler was 8 years old, 4 years after Tyler's mother, Pat, left the two of them for a life that didn't include either one. Bob was a quiet, decent accountant who had no idea how to braid his son's hair for picture day or explain to a young boy why his mother wasn't coming to his birthday party that year. I wasn't looking to become anyone's mother when I met him. I became one anyway, the way you do when a scared kid starts leaving his math homework on your kitchen table because he's hoping you'll check it. For the first 9 years of that, I did it around deployments. That's the part this family never lets go of, and the part they never once asked me the actual shape of. I missed Tyler's 8th grade graduation because I was on a rotation out of Ramstein, running a patient with a traumatic brain injury back from Landstuhl. I missed his junior year football championship because I was mid-deployment and the satellite phone connection dropped 3 times before I finally got 40 seconds to hear the score from Bob, standing in a parking lot so the signal would hold. I did not miss those things because I loved being gone. I missed them because somewhere, at the same hour, another mother's son was on a gurney needing someone exactly like me, not to miss him. Nobody in this family has ever once asked me what I was doing instead. They've only ever asked, gently, pointedly, at holidays, "Do you regret how much you missed?" I've learned to answer that question the way I answer most things that would cost me something to answer honestly. I smile, I say something short, and I let the room decide what it wants to believe about me. One Thanksgiving still stands out. Tyler was 16, telling the table about a science fair project he'd built almost entirely alone that year because I'd been on rotation for 5 of the 8 weeks he'd spent working on it. Bob's mother, listening with real warmth, said, "It's a wonder you turned out so grounded, sweetheart, with your mother traveling so much." She meant Pat, who hadn't called Tyler in 4 months. I had spent those same 4 months emailing him physics diagrams from a laptop balanced on an aircraft crate, and I said nothing. Tyler, oblivious to the undercurrent, laughed and said, "Diane helped me with basically the whole thing, actually," and the table moved on to the pie before anyone registered what he'd said. He doesn't remember that moment. I remember it exactly, the way you remember the specific hour a small wound opens, instead of the years it spends healing over. None of that is really what this story is about, though. It's about who decided, 6 weeks before this wedding, that I didn't need to know it had a date. The person who decided the most, over the years, was Bob's older sister, Carol. Carol Whitfield Doyle has run every family gathering for as long as I've been part of this family, with the specific, tireless energy of a woman convinced that if she just manages every detail well enough, some earlier version of this family might come back into focus. She was the one who cried at my wedding to Bob. Not happy tears, I came to understand later, but the particular grief of a sister watching her brother's life move somewhere she hadn't approved of. Carol never said an unkind word to my face. She specialized instead in a kind of soft, ongoing erasure. Family photo captions that read, "Bob, Tyler, and Pat," from events I was standing directly next to when the photo was taken. Toasts at Thanksgiving that thanked the two people who raised this boy, meaning Bob and Pat, spoken while I sat at the same table holding the dish I'd cooked. A running family joke, repeated at every gathering for a decade, about how Diane's on a mission whenever I wasn't in a photo, delivered with a laugh, landing every single time like something that wasn't actually funny. I let most of it go for 19 years, not because it didn't land, because I'd made a private decision a long time ago that I would rather be quietly certain of my own worth than spend my life performing it for people determined not to see it. That decision worked, mostly, until the day a wedding coordinator named Ashley called my house to confirm a head count for a wedding nobody had told me was happening in 4 days. I called Tyler first. He's 27 now, tall and a little awkward on the phone the way he's been since he was 14. And when he picked up, I could hear a restaurant kitchen behind him. He manages a bar and grill 2 towns over, has for 3 years, and he's good at it, steady in a way that would make any parent proud. "Diane," he said. "Hey, everything okay?" "I got a call from Cypress Hall," I said, confirming Saturday. There was a pause, the specific pause of a young man doing quick, uncomfortable math. "I thought Aunt Carol sent you the invite weeks ago," he said. "She said she was handling the mailing list personally. I swear, I asked her twice if you and Dad were both on it." I believed him. I want to say that clearly, because it would have been easy, in that moment, to let 19 years of small cuts turn into one large accusation aimed at a 27-year-old who sounded genuinely rattled on the other end of the line. "I'm sure it's a mix-up," I said, which was generous, and which I did not entirely believe. "Diane, I want you there," Tyler said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word there, in a way that told me he meant it. "You raised me. You know that, right? Whatever's happened with the invites, that's not me not wanting you." "I know," I said. "Go finish your shift. We'll sort out the details." I hung up before either of us had to sit inside a silence that neither of us was ready for yet. Bob's reaction when I told him that evening was the reaction I'd learned over 19 years to expect from him. Quiet discomfort, followed by an attempt to smooth the moment over rather than examine it. "I'm sure it's just Carol being Carol," he said, not looking up from the newspaper he wasn't really reading. "She gets overwhelmed with logistics. It's probably nothing." "Bob," I said, "I found out about our son's wedding date from a caterer." He set the newspaper down then, finally, and rubbed a hand over his face in the particular way he does when he already knows he's about to disappoint me, and hasn't yet found the courage to do anything about it instead. "I know it sounds bad," he said. "I'll talk to her." He didn't talk to her that night, or the next morning, and by the time 2 more days had passed without a single word from Carol, from Pat, or from Bob's mother, I understood something about my husband that I'd known quietly for a long time and had never let myself say out loud. Bob would always choose the path that avoided conflict with his sister over the path that required him to stand between her and me. It wasn't cruelty. It was exhaustion, dressed up as peacekeeping. and it had cost me small pieces of belonging in this family for almost 2 decades, one avoided confrontation at a time, until the debt had quietly grown larger than either of us had ever bothered to add up. I didn't confront him about it that week. I filed it away the same way I file everything that hurts and doesn't yet require action, carefully, honestly, and without letting it become the whole conversation before I understood the full shape of what had actually happened. 22 years of triage teaches you that the loudest wound in the room isn't always the one that needs attention first. I made exactly one phone call that could be called an investigation, and I made it the way I'd make any inquiry I actually wanted a clean answer to, calmly, directly, to the one person most likely to simply tell me the truth. I called Kat. Tyler's mother and I have never been close, but we've also never been enemies. In 19 years, our relationship had settled into something like professional courtesy. 2 women who'd both loved the same boy at different points in his life, neither of us fully certain how much room there was for the other. Pat, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to just answer it plainly. Did you know I wasn't on the guest list? There was a long silence on her end, long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. Diane, she said, I assumed you'd been sent an invitation months ago. I asked Carol directly, back in March, whether you and Bob were both confirmed, because I didn't want it to look like... She stopped herself. I didn't want it to look like I was trying to push you out of anything. Carol told me it was handled. I sat with that for a moment. It would have been easy, and satisfying in a small, ugly way, to let Pat be the villain of this story. She was the one whose name sat on the head table, where mine should have been. She was the one who'd left first, years ago, and reappeared for milestones with a lightness that always seemed to cost her nothing. But the woman on the other end of the phone sounded genuinely uneasy, and genuine unease isn't something people fake well over the phone to someone they have no reason to impress. Carol handled the mailing list, I said. It wasn't a question anymore. She's handled everything, Pat said. Every vendor, every seating chart, the whole run of show. I offered to help, and she said, families shouldn't need to ask twice to be included. A short, humorless laugh. I didn't think about how that sentence could cut 2 directions. I thanked her, and I meant it. And when I hung up the phone, I understood that I had spent 4 days quietly assuming the wrong woman had erased me from this wedding. I understood something else, too, once I let myself sit with it. Carol has never actually been angry at me for who I am. She has spent 19 years quietly grieving a version of this family that stopped existing the day Pat walked out the door. And somewhere in her mind, my marrying Bob 2 years later didn't rescue that family. It sealed the door shut on the chance of it ever reopening. I wasn't the woman who broke this family. I was, in Carol's quiet accounting, the woman who made sure it never went back together. And for that, she has spent 19 years making certain I understood, in 100 small ways, that I would always be a guest in a house she still considered, in some unspoken part of herself, unfinished business. I don't say that to excuse what she did. I say it because understanding a person's wound doesn't obligate you to keep absorbing the damage they do while nursing it. I want to tell you what I decided to do with that information, because I think it says more about who I actually am than anything I could tell you about my career. I decided not to call Carol. I decided not to demand an invitation, not to show up at Cypress Hall 4 days later and insist on my rightful seat, not to make Tyler's wedding day into the day his stepmother finally had it out with his aunt. I had spent 22 years learning that the people worth being right in front of are rarely the people you have to argue your way toward, and I was not going to spend the last week before my stepson's wedding fighting for a seat at a table that had already told me, quietly, exactly how it saw me. Instead, I made my own plan for Saturday. Every year, on the second Saturday in June, I visit the orthopedic and rehabilitation ward at the Veterans Hospital 40 minutes from our house. I've done it for 14 years, since I retired, without ever once telling Bob's family why that particular Saturday matters to me, because it has never once occurred to any of them to ask what I do with my time when I'm not being weighed against Pat in a family photo caption. It isn't a grand ritual. I bring a box of decent coffee and sit with whoever's willing to talk, mostly younger veterans relearning how to use a hand or a leg that doesn't work the way it used to. some of them frustrated past words, some of them making jokes about it because the jokes are easier than the alternative. I don't tell most of them I was aircrew. I just sit and I listen. And some years, that's the only thing anyone in that ward needed from a stranger that day. That Saturday is the anniversary of my last flight. I was going to spend the morning the way I've spent it every year since, sitting with men and women a generation younger than me who are still learning to walk again, some of them missing pieces of themselves that no wedding toast will ever fully account for. And I was going to let my stepson get married without me in the room, quietly, with more dignity than anger, and I was going to be at peace with that decision by the time I got home that evening. I told Bob my plan 2 days before the wedding. He looked at me for a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that might have been shame, and said only, "That's not right, Diane. None of this is right." He still didn't call his sister. I noticed. I filed that away too. Tyler showed up at our house the night before the wedding, alone, without calling first, which is not something he does. He stood on our porch in a t-shirt with flour on it from his restaurant, looking like he hadn't slept, and he said, "Aunt Carol printed the final table assignments today. You're not on any of them, not even the back tables." I asked her again, straight out, and she said, He stopped, and I watched him decide in real time whether to protect his aunt or tell me the truth. He chose the truth. She said, "Diane's never really been the sentimental type. I didn't think she'd want to be singled out." I have absorbed a great many sentences over 19 years designed to make my absence sound like my own preference. That one still found a place to land. "Tyler," I said, "you don't have to fix this tonight." "I want you there," he said. And this time his voice didn't crack. It went flat and certain in a way that reminded me, briefly and painfully, of myself. Not because Aunt Carol finally feels bad, because you're the one who taught me how to tie a tie for 8th grade graduation over a laptop screen from a base I couldn't even find on a map at the time, because you used to call me every single Sunday from wherever you were, even when it was 2 a.m. your time, and you never once made me feel like that call was an inconvenience to you. His eyes were wet now, and he didn't try to hide it. "I want you there tomorrow. Not at the back. Not as an afterthought. As my mom." I stood in my own doorway for a long moment, a 53-year-old retired flight nurse who has kept dozens of strangers alive at 31,000 feet without her hand shaking once. And I let my hand shake, just slightly, at the word mom coming out of this particular young man's mouth for the first time in either of our lives. "Then I'll be there," I said. "But Tyler, I need you to know, this isn't me forgiving anyone tonight. I'm coming for you and Emily. That's the whole reason. That's the only reason it should ever need to be," he said. I want to explain one more thing before the wedding, because it matters to everything that happened there, and because it's a story I've told exactly 3 people in 15 years. 15 years ago, on a night flight out of a forward surgical site in Afghanistan, my crew picked up a young Army staff sergeant named Marcus Webb, 23 years old, injured by an improvised explosive device that had already cost him part of his left leg below the knee and put a fragment dangerously close to a major vessel in his abdomen. 40 minutes into the flight, he went critical. His blood pressure dropped in a way that told me, with the flat certainty you develop after enough of these flights, that the standard steps weren't going to be enough. I made a call that night that wasn't strictly standard protocol, working with our flight surgeon under conditions that gave us minutes, not the luxury of consultation. It worked. Staff Sergeant Webb was still breathing when we handed him off in Landstuhl. That call triggered a review that took 4 months to clear me, and by the end of it, I'd quietly decided I was done. I retired 14 years ago and never learned what happened to him after Landstuhl. Most flight nurses hand a patient off and never learn the rest of the story. I kept one small thing from that flight, the way I kept small things from a handful of others over the years. A plain aluminum ID bracelet, cut from his wrist during transport, tucked since then into a little tin on my dresser that Bob has never once asked about in 19 years, because Bob has never once asked me what any of the objects in that tin mean. I didn't bring the bracelet to the wedding. I didn't think, walking into Cypress Hall the next afternoon in a pale blue dress instead of dress blues, that any part of that flight was about to walk back into my life at all. The wedding itself was lovely, in the particular way weddings are lovely when you're standing slightly outside the family photographs being taken around you. Carol saw me arrive and went the color of old paper for exactly 1 second before recovering into a bright, brittle smile. And, Diane, we didn't realize you. Wonderful, wonderful, come in. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Wouldn't have missed it, I said, and walked past her into the reception hall. Pat found me near the gift table and took my hand in both of hers, an unusually direct gesture from a woman I'd never once hugged in 19 years. I want you to know I told Carol this morning that if you weren't seated properly, I'd give up my own seat at the head table, she said. I don't know what's between the two of you, and honestly, Diane, I don't think it's ever really been about me at all. I believed her. I'll admit that surprised me more than almost anything else that day. The seating, as it turned out, had one final irony left in it. Carol, scrambling that morning to correct a table she'd never planned to need to correct, had wedged me into an open seat at table 12, a table I later learned had been assembled almost entirely from the bride's side, family friends of Colonel James Bell, Emily's father, people Carol had no personal investment in, and therefore hadn't bothered to arrange with any particular care. Which is how I ended up seated, by accident, next to a solidly built man in his late 30s with a faint limp I recognized before I ever looked at his face. A limp that carries a specific rhythm you learn to read after enough years working aeromedical transport. His place card read, Marcus Webb. The venue itself had that particular late afternoon warmth of a June wedding done well. String lights not yet turned on against a sky still bright enough not to need them. The smell of lilies and warm bread rolls, a quartet somewhere near the terrace working through something soft enough not to compete with conversation. Carol moved through the room like a woman conducting an orchestra only she could hear, adjusting a centerpiece here, redirecting a photographer there, entirely unaware that the one seating air she hadn't personally curated was about to undo 6 weeks of careful curating. I hadn't planned to talk to Marcus Webb for more than the length of a dinner. I certainly hadn't planned on recognizing that limp, or on the particular, careful way he lowered himself into his chair, weight shifted onto his right side before his left leg followed, a compensation pattern I'd watched 100 patients learn in physical therapy wards, the kind of walk that tells you everything about an injury without a single word being said about it. We made ordinary small talk for the first 20 minutes, the way strangers do at a wedding table. How we knew the couple, whether the chicken or the fish had been the better choice, how long the drive-in had been. He told me unprompted about the leg, a straightforward mention, no self-pity in it, the kind of fact a person states once they've long since made peace with saying it out loud. He talked about the prosthetic he'd finally settled on after 3 bad ones, about learning to run again 2 years after that, about a half marathon he'd finished the previous fall that had made his physical therapist cry harder than he had. I found myself telling him, in turn, about my own last few years of service, careful, as always, to keep the details general, the way I keep them general with everyone. He mentioned easily that he worked construction estimating now for a company owned by Colonel Bell, and that Bell had more or less adopted him into the family after they served together years apart, in different units, on different timelines, brought together later by the specific gravity that pulls veterans toward each other in civilian life. You said your name's Diane? He said, somewhere around the second course, glancing at my own place card as if to confirm it. Diane Whitfield?
That's right.
Not. He stopped, and something moved across his face that I recognized instantly, because I have seen that exact expression before, on family members meeting a medevac crew for the first time at a hospital bedside. You didn't happen to go by Foster. Years back. Air Force. The room did not go silent. That particular trope belongs to moments louder than this one. What actually happened was smaller, and to me, far more precise. The low hum of 200 wedding conversations kept going, exactly as it had been, and inside that hum, one man set his fork down slowly on the edge of his plate, the metal tapping the porcelain once, softly, and looked at me like he was doing the same math I'd watched Tyler do on the phone 4 days earlier. Foster, I said. Yes, that was my name. 15 years ago, Marcus Webb said, his voice lower now, rougher. Night flight, out of a forward sight. I was 23. I lost part of my leg to an IED, and somewhere over that flight my blood pressure went somewhere to keep me from bleeding out before we hit Landstuhl. I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in 15 years. Not the calm, professional stillness I wear like a second uniform, but something closer to the ground, unguarded. "I've spent 15 years trying to find out who that was," he said. "The paperwork never had a name attached that I could ever run down. I asked at 2 reunions. I asked a records office once and got nowhere. I gave up on it, honestly, about 10 years ago." He looked at me for a long moment. "It was you." "It was me," I said. What happened next was not something I asked for, arranged, or in any way saw coming. And I want to be honest that if it had not happened exactly the way it did, I would have finished that dinner quietly and gone home, and never once tried to make it happen a different way. Marcus Webb stood up from table 12. He didn't ask permission from the DJ, didn't check with Colonel Bell, didn't do anything but push his chair back and stand there for a moment, with his hand resting briefly on the table, the way a man studies himself before saying something he's been carrying a long time. Sorry to interrupt," he said, loud enough that the nearest tables turned, then loud enough a beat later that the whole room did. "I know this isn't really the moment, but I need to say something, and I don't think I'll get another one like it." Tyler, at the head table, looked up, confused. Carol's smile had frozen somewhere between polite and alarmed. 15 years ago, I was a 23-year-old staff sergeant bleeding out on a medevac flight out of Afghanistan, Marcus said. A flight nurse made a call that saved my life that night. A call that wasn't standard, that took guts I don't think I fully understood until years later, when I learned what it actually cost her to make it. I never got her name. I've spent 15 years wondering who she was, whether she ever knew what happened to me after they handed me off, whether she ever thought about that flight at all. He turned and looked directly at me, at table 12, in my pale blue dress, holding a fork I'd forgotten I was still holding. And for one long second, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath along with him. "She's sitting right there," he said. "Major Diane Foster, retired, table 12. I don't remember standing up. I remember Tyler's face, understanding arriving on it in real time. Not shock, exactly, but something closer to a debt finally being paid in front of him. A full accounting, at last, of what all those missed Sundays and phone calls from bases he couldn't find on a map had actually been in service of. I remember Colonel Bell rising first, without a word, and coming to attention with a formal salute crisp enough that I felt it in my own spine before I understood what my body was doing in response. I remember Marcus Webb, still standing, bringing his own hand up in the same gesture a half-second later, and 2 other men at nearby tables, veterans I hadn't even clocked as veterans until that exact moment, rising to do the same. I stood there in a room full of people who had spent an evening not thinking about me at all, and returned the gesture the only way 22 years of training let me, quietly, without theater, my spine straight, my eyes steady on the man whose life had once depended on a decision I made in the dark, at 31,000 feet. "Thank you for finding me," I said when I could finally speak. I never stopped wondering either. For a few seconds, nobody in that room moved to sit back down, and I understood, standing there, that this particular kind of stillness, a hall full of strangers and family alike holding a single quiet beat together, was not the same performance I'd spent 19 years learning to survive. This one didn't require me to shrink to fit it. Colonel Bell was the first to break it, clearing his throat and saying, loud enough for the tables nearby, "Major Foster, on behalf of every soldier who ever made it home because someone like you was doing your job right, thank you." Someone near the back started clapping, and it spread the way that kind of thing does at a wedding, imperfectly, unevenly, entirely real. I won't pretend the whole family transformed in that single moment. That isn't how families like this one actually change, and I'd be lying if I dressed it up as a fairy tale ending. Carol never apologized, not that night or in the weeks after. What she did do, quietly, was stop repeating the old joke about Diane's on a mission, and I noticed that she hasn't once tried to plan a family event without consulting me since. 6 months later, at Christmas, she asked almost formally whether the family photo captions would read Bob, Diane, and Tyler. I told her that would be fine. She printed that photo and framed it, and it sits on her own mantle now, as close to an apology as I expect I'll ever get from Carol Whitfield Doyle, and I've decided that's allowed to be enough. Pat found me near the end of the night and told me, unprompted, that she'd spent 19 years telling herself a story where she was still the mother who mattered most, and that watching a stranger stand up and tell the truth had cost her that story for nothing. "I owe you an apology I should have given a long time ago," she said. "You don't owe me a performance of one at a wedding," I told her, "but I'll take it if it's real." "It's real," she said, and I believed her. Bob found me last, near the coat check, and said the thing I'd needed him to say out loud for most of 19 years, that he should have stood between me and his sister a long time ago, that he'd let me carry things alone he should have carried with me. I didn't forgive him fully that night, and I told him so. "You have time to show me you mean it," I said. Not an apology at a wedding, a different Thanksgiving. Tyler asked me to dance before the night ended, not the mother-son dance, which he had already given, by his own choice, to Pat, and which I never once asked him to reconsider. He asked me for a second dance instead, one nobody had planned. "I should have fought harder for you a long time before this week," he said, his chin resting against the top of my head the way it used to when he was still shorter than me. "You never once made me feel like a mission." I held on to that sentence the whole drive home. I still visit that veterans ward every second Saturday in June. Last year, for the first time in 14 years, I brought a +1, Marcus Webb, who now comes with me most years because it turns out neither of us had ever fully stopped carrying that flight. The aluminum bracelet still sits in the little tin on my dresser. I finally told Bob what it was, 2 months after the wedding, on an ordinary Tuesday evening with no audience attached to the telling. He held it for a long time before he handed it back to me. 22 years, he said, and I never once asked you what any of this cost you. "You're asking now," I said. "That's what I needed. Not an apology. A question." "I used to think you had to make a scene to be seen. I don't think that anymore. Some rooms just take longer to catch up to the truth." I'd love to hear from you in the comments, especially if you've ever been the person left off a guest list, a photo, or a toast by people who should have known better than to assume they already knew your whole story. And if stories like this one mean something to you, stay close. I have a feeling Table 12 isn't the last place someone's going to stand up and say a name out loud that a family tried very hard not to say.